Today I want to show you the different techniques for gouache that I use and how you can get started with gouache paint in your sketchbook. I like to have one pan in my field kit filled with white gouache so that I have an opaque white that I can also mix with all the other colors on my palette. You can also set up a small palette with gouache that works on its own, but I usually use it together with watercolor since it's basically the same kind of paint and you can mix the two. However, gouache behaves a little bit differently because it's opaque. It can be used in your sketchbook in a few different ways, and sometimes it's even best to use it straight from the tube. So let's take a look at this medium. So what is gouache? Gouache is a water-soluble paint that consists mainly of pigments, a binder, which is usually gum arabic or honey, and sometimes chalk. And what makes the paint opaque is either the high amount of pigment or the chalk, and manufacturers have different processes for adding opacity to their paints. Cheap gouache paints will often be a bit streaky, whereas artist-grade paints or even good student-grade paints, you can apply the paint in even and opaque layers. So how does gouache differ from watercolors? Watercolors are based on the principle of being translucent, so you can build up layers of paint and get a glaze effect that can add depth to your image. And gouache can be used in that way too, but it's a bit harder to build up a lot of transparent paint layers, and it's not meant to be used that way. So with gouache you often paint a bit differently. You start with a layer of thinned down paint and then you use less and less water for each layer that goes on top. And this is also called fat over lean, as oil painters would say. If you've painted with oil, acrylics or casein before, then gouache will seem similar and you can achieve similar effects. Gouache paint will dry to a smooth, solid surface that you can't look through. You can use this in your sketchbook if you want to add bright parts over a painted surface, like white clouds over a dark sky or bright markings on a bird. Can be easier to add these details back in than to paint around them. Another thing to keep in mind is that with watercolor you have to work from light to dark, so you can't add any brightness or white space back into your painting. And with gouache you can add white highlights over your dark areas or work from dark to white because you can add light colors onto darker areas. So as I said, I keep a bit of white gouache when I'm sketching in watercolor, mostly for highlights or for correcting small mistakes. For a full gouache painting, you could use it straight from the tube or use a tube of white gouache and mix it with your tube watercolors. They are fully mixable, so you can exchange the two. Or you could take your gouache with you in a small field kit like this one, or as tubes. However, gouache handles best when it's used directly out of the tube. It has a creamy consistency fresh from the tube that you can use for very thick strokes, and while it can be reactivated when it's been dried, it will not be as soft and as mixable. When you're in the field and just want to add a bit of white or light values over your sketch, then you might appreciate a small field kit like this. I mostly have light colors on my gouache field kit, since everything dark can be done with this watercolor field kit. And I use the paints for highlights or for clouds or for fixing mistakes. However, I have to say, since I have added a white pen to my watercolor set, I rarely use this small gouache field kit. I only take this watercolor set with me. When I want to do a painting entirely in gouache, like this one, then I use usually fresh gouache straight from the tube. So a word about brushes. You can use your watercolor brushes for gouache, although you have to be careful with very expensive sable brushes, because gouache is a bit chalkier and it's a bit more harsh on the bristles. And this is why I use mostly synthetic brushes with my gouache paints, often the ones that are made for acrylics, especially these flat ones, since they are a little bit firmer. So gouache paints usually comes in tubes, so if you just want to use it here and there in your sketchbook, then you will want to refill it into pans. There are a few brands that dry better than others. Some paints just turn into solid cakes or they crumble when you re-wet them. And I'll show you that quickly in this palette, so you can see the paint dries and then crumbles and just comes off. And for some of these, this works better. I've tried out a lot in refilling this into pans and re-wetting. So if you're used to the easy re-wetting of watercolor, then don't be surprised. You have to work for your paint to come out of the pan a little bit more. I found that Schminke gouache works best for me when it's re-wetted. Then Winsor & Newton needs a bit more time, and most cheap paints aren't really worth a try. So I find, for example, Royal Talents is a company that makes, I'd say, good student-grade paint that works really well when it's used fresh from the tube. But when you re-wet it, it just crumbles and dries, and you can see it comes off in these crumbly bits. So it's really not good if you want to use it in these outdoor palettes. It can help to add a drop of glycerin to your fresh paint. So you add a tiny drop of glycerin and then stir it a little bit. This will make it easier to be re-wet, and it keeps it more moist. I usually like to add the gouache straight and fresh from the tube each time I paint. This is less practical for outdoor work, but for me it's the best way to use this kind of paint. So let's try this out. I have a bit of fresh gouache here. I'll just add a slightly damp brush, so a little bit of water, and you can see this is turning into a nice creamy consistency. And with this I can paint a really nice opaque layer of paint. So if I use the same color from my dried well, you can see it takes a lot of work. I have to work into the paint a lot, and for this paint it actually works fairly well to get a layer that's similar to this one. And this is partly because it hasn't been in a dry state for very long, so it has dried for a few days only, and also it's a good quality gouache, so this works very well with Schminke colors and it works less well with others. So let's take a look at this student grade paint that I showed you earlier. So you can see it's a bit harder to get it loose and to get it to re-wet, but I can still get sort of a thin layer from this. Now the great thing about gouache is that you can use it really thick and really creamy. So I have a lot of paint on my brush right now, and if I want I can just paint over another layer. So the opacity of this paint is really what it has going for itself. And then you could also do these effects, like with a dry brush you can also do these kind of effects. So gouache is really versatile. And if you're a watercolor painter, then you will see that gouache needs to be applied a bit thicker than watercolor, particularly when you paint on top of darker layers. So you can work from dark to light, and for this you can't make your mixes too thin. They will turn transparent and the paper will buckle and you will see through the darker layers. So cream-like consistency like this one works well. Let's try this with this white. So you can see if I reactivate my white, then I can get it to a creamy consistency, but it isn't really opaque. And if I use some white fresh from the tube, let's try this. And if I add very little water, it's probably a bit too much already, then you can see I'm getting a nice white layer, so I get good coverage. Even now you can see it starts to come through a little bit, so you have to really be careful with the amount of water that you add to these layers that need to be opaque. So as I said, you can apply gouache with a very dry brush and get these nice textured effects. And even this works better when you use your paint fresh from the tube, because when you re-wet your dried cakes, then you will have to add water, and this will make it harder for these dry brush effects. So you can see I can get a really thin layer of these dry brushing here. So you can get in layers with gouache to a certain extent when you're working with very dry technique. But when you use a lot of water, then these layers will become reactivated and the color will likely get a little bit muddy, like you can see here. If you work quickly, you can get away with it. So remember this when you work in layers with gouache. Gouache paint also has a slight drying shift, so light colors will dry a bit lighter and dark colors a bit darker. And this has to do with the change of surface when the paint is drying. If you're unsure, then you can make it a few test swatches, although I found this to be not such a big problem in practice. So I rarely think about this when I paint, and I find I adapt pretty quickly when I paint. So as you can see here, I'm trying again. So you still get coverage with these lighter layers, and here you can see that the layer below reactivates, and I'm really getting some of this English red, this darker red, and it spreads into my yellow ochre here. So I want to show you a few examples and situations in which I use gouache in my sketchbook. I've slowly changed my use of gouache paint over the years, from just adding a dab of white to my watercolor sketches, and I still do this, to mixing more colors, and now I do entire sketches with gouache. So for small details, gouache can save a lot of time. You don't have to believe the watercolor purists out there who don't allow white on their palette. I know this is a very common thing still. So if you look at some of the old masters like Winslow Homer or John Singer Sargent, then you will notice they all used white in their paintings. And if they can, then so can you. So let's take a look at some sketches. You can, as I said, use gouache for details and highlights that you add at the end on top of dark areas, like for this barn owl. This works very well for highlights or for small feathers on birds. Also, you can see here these highlights were painted over the dark areas with gouache. Also, these markings around the eye. And also some of these highlights. You can also use this technique for details on butterfly wings, for example. That's also a great way to add these very fine and very thin lines. You can also get interesting effects with gouache on toned paper, like in these sketches where I used it as my highlight color and let the paper be the middle tone. So that's also a very interesting way to use gouache if you just want to use it sparingly. And then I have sketches like these where I use the paint fresh from the tube. And I plan in more time to do these sketches, obviously. So this scene is painted entirely in gouache, and it's more about light and color for me and less about a spontaneous sketch from nature. So this is well planned, and this uses a palette with fresh gouache straight from the tube. So what are my color choices for gouache? If you're new to gouache, then you might appreciate a more diverse palette, and particularly if you use these pre-mixed pens, then you might want more colors to choose from, because you can't really mix these when you're out in the field. As I said, they're a little harder to reactivate, so you might want more colors. Also for this palette, I find that it has almost too many colors, and if I reduce the number of colors in a painting, then I usually get a better result. So this is why I really don't like this palette too much, because it has too much choice for me, really. And a good number of colors is usually between 4 and 8 for me for any given painting. I choose my colors new each time when I do a painting, and one thing that you do need is a white. So you usually use the most white because it's essential for mixing. And then a bright yellow and an earth yellow like a raw sienna or a yellow ochre. I often have a bright red like a cadmium red, then an ultramarine blue. Sometimes I also have a cool blue like a cerulean blue, and then an earth red like an English red or a burnt sienna is a good choice. And I also usually have a darker tone like a burnt umber or a black. And this is already a big selection. You could easily get away with half of these paints. So I have a bright and a dull yellow, and then two kinds of reds, and then my blue and a light and a dark tone. And with this palette, you're really flexible. So for example, this painting was painted with a similar selection to paints like this one. And you definitely don't need a lot of paints to start. You could also add in a green so that you have an easier time for mixing, but you definitely don't need that. If you have a blue and a yellow, then you can easily mix your greens. And what I like to do sometimes is to make these sort of mixing charts where you can find out what kind of colors you can get from a very limited palette. So this is a great way to find out what kind of colors you can get out of your paint selection. And these are each of these are done with either 3 or 4 different colors. So you can see you can get a wide range of colors with just a few tubes of paint. That's it for today. I'd really like to know if you have tried gouache in your sketchbook and what your experiences were. I hope you found this video useful. If you enjoyed it, then give me a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions or want to see something specific, then also let me know below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, happy sketching.